Here's Mike. How are you, Mike? That's no problem. We're just talking things through. Everybody's ready. You're very quiet, by the way. Your microphone is very quiet. Yeah. Okay. We all ready? Okay. Yeah. I see all the streams are up already. Yeah. So I'm just gonna. Everybody should take 30 seconds to go to Facebook, find the stream, and share the stream. Okay. On the event page. Hosted by Socialist Alternative. Because it does make a difference. Some Facebook celebrities on this call, you gotta share your thing, but don't be watching it while you're talking, right? Because there's a delay. Yeah, there's like 5 seconds delay between what you're saying and right.
Is it pronounced CERT exams? That's how you say it?
Yep.
Did you have to take those as a kid? No? Okay.
Hey, sorry, Mike. People are saying that you can hear us on the stream.
We have to make a decision as ordinary working people that we must organize for a political, economic, and social alternative.
It's actually Stalinism itself that has prevented so many people from drawing the same conclusions that Lenin drew.
The limits of this planet are the limits also of capitalism.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. We discuss pressing issues, highlight current events and active struggles, answer questions, and we bring the lessons of history to the present day. World to Win is hosted by the International Socialist Alternative, an organization made up of sections in more than 30 countries and existing on every continent. We don't just make this show. We're actively organizing in workplaces and communities every day. We're living in an era of one crisis tumbling right into the next, a deadly pandemic into a global depression.
This is a far, far more serious crisis for their system than that.
A global depression into potential climate chaos. Yet, at the same time, we're witnessing a momentous return of the labor movement, of workplace organizing, with more people getting up and getting involved every day.
Tens of thousands of people are going out to protest every week.
We need to rise to meet these new challenges. Tune in every Sunday to hear socialists from across the world talk about what's happening now and where to go next. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternative's YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!
Welcome everyone to the International Socialist Alternative weekly broadcast of World to Win. My name is Toya and I'm coming to you live from Boston in the United States. I want to ask everyone to take a few minutes to share this stream, start a watch party, and let all your friends and family know what you're doing right now because no one is going to want to miss this exciting episode that we have today. It's actually a relaunch of our show, and we have a new format where we're going to feature different segments, starting with, general perspectives of the world situation, then diving a little bit deeper into a topic. And then at the end, make sure you stay tuned for the full hour because we're going to feature and highlight one of our sections of the International Socialist Alternative and the work that they're doing. Let's get some guesses in the comments section to see if you know which section it is. I'll give you a clue. It's a story of students fighting back and winning. We want you to engage with us in the show. There is going to be a portion where you can ask our speakers questions to get their opinions and their perspectives on what's happening in the world today. So let's start off with introducing our guests. First, we have Claire, who is a socialist alternative activist in London. Hi, Claire. And next we have Eljeer, who's from New York City, who is a frontline hospital worker. How's it going, Eljeer? Now let's actually start with you, Eljeer, because you're in New York City, which is kind of the epicenter, especially in the US, of this coronavirus pandemic madness. And they're talking about reopening the economy. What's your take on it?
Well, what's interesting that the New York Times, the voice in the printed word of the U.S. and global elite, has documented that there's 100,000 who have died of COVID-19. This is an unprecedented moment, certainly in U.S. history. And as Governor Cuomo, as Mayor de Blasio begin the process of reopening the economy, and this is ongoing throughout the country, the level of anxiety and stress that many working people are faced with is stunning, to say the least. The question of social distancing, of having the proper PPE equipment, the type of tests that we need, and certainly the lack of a vaccine puts this question front and center in the minds of workers who are unionized and workers who are not unionized. COVID-19 does not discriminate. So for the working class of the United States, we will have to fight on the front lines to make sure we have the resources once we get back to work, and certainly have to push back against the attempts of austerity that every city and state government will attempt to enact to put their crisis basically on our lives.
Thanks so much, Eljeer, and thanks for the work that you're doing. You know, being a frontline worker, I can only imagine the stress, the fear that you have for your family. But I want to go to Claire. How is it in London in the UK? Is everything going back to business as usual?
Well, we've had lots of similarities, I think, with the situation in the US. Britain is actually the country in Europe which has had the highest death toll as a result of coronavirus. And here, like in much of Europe and in much of the world, there's now this real drive from the ruling class and from the rich to get things reopened, to get people back to work, whether or not that's actually safe. And Johnson and his government have been driving for this. There's a situation now in Britain where you're still not allowed to visit your family. You can meet one of your parents in a park. That's the maximum contact you're allowed with people who aren't in your household, where massive workplaces of thousands of people are being asked to open up, and in which there's absolutely no concrete and binding guidance from the government on safety measures that should be put in place in those workplaces in order to prevent a second spread of the virus and thousands of people potentially losing their lives as a result. And one of the things that's really important about this is that the government have not just got away with it. There's a huge backlash which has started to develop against this approach, particularly led by well-organised sections of workers. And a real flashpoint in Britain at the moment is schools. So Johnson made an announcement this afternoon, and they're trying to press ahead with a plan to reopen schools on the 1st of June. And teachers are furious about this because there's no clarity on how this will be done safely and how social distancing can be maintained in the school environment, on testing. We're still massively off the target that the government has set of 100,000 tests a day being carried out. They're unable to deliver on that. And there's real fear this is going to lead to a second spike. And thousands of teachers have joined the teachers union, the National Education Union. There was a recent meeting which was held online, a gathering of 20,000 teachers, which obviously is a huge number in a country like the UK. And there seems to be a real determination to fight this. We've already seen some employers force back from reopening because workers have taken action. That was true with Dyson, for example, one of the major companies in Britain. They were forced not to reopen fully their workplace and so on by workers taking action against them. So there's huge potential there for struggle on this. And I'll just mention one final thing, which is a story which perhaps isn't being reported on as much internationally, but which is absolutely huge news here in Britain, which summarises the fact that this is not a situation in which we're all in this together, because Boris Johnson's chief advisor has been exposed as having broken in the most flagrant way the lockdown rules just days after they were announced by Boris Johnson. So he was spotted not once, not twice, but 3 times, more than 250 miles away from his home. So while working class people have made these tremendous sacrifices, have been struggling through very difficult circumstances in lockdown, have lost their lives in many cases, the rich elites and the Tories and the government have a completely different set of rules which they think apply to them, and they will do whatever they like. And I think that really hits home that this is about class.
Thanks so much, Claire. It's just absolutely disgusting that we live in a society where there's rules depending on, which class you fall in or how much money you make. But I want to go back to Eljeer. Now, a lot of workers in the US are worried about going back to work, but if they don't go back to work, they can lose their unemployment benefits. Many people are actually making more on unemployment, which just shows how low wages actually are. real quick, what do you say to those workers who are scared to go back to work?
I think one of the key things to say and to highlight is the need to get organized. If you're part of a union, certainly use that platform that you have as a union member to discuss, to prepare, to put demands upon the bosses, but also upon the trade union leadership, who have really failed in this moment. Only a few unions and union leaderships, like the nurses union in the United States, have played a vital role in talking about PPE, talking about testing, talking about social distancing. There's a point that Claire touched on. Here in New York, it was 2 weeks before the shutdown began. And in those 2 weeks, the schools were still open. Kids were going to school. Teachers were going to school. And we had over 60 teachers die from COVID-19. And that's because they did not shut down the city fast enough. Maybe those teachers will still be with us today. So the question of organizing, of mobilizing, of agitating around these demands in the workplace is going to be absolutely essential going forward. And even for low-wage workers, we have seen low-wage workers go on strike. Instacart, Amazon, those are great examples, really, of the possibilities that low-wage workers can organize, can mobilize, and fight on the key issues that matter to them. And certainly, it's going to be a generalized process, I think, going forward here in the United States.
Thanks so much, Eljeer. I want to shift the conversation a little bit into how the pandemic is affecting the environment. So Claire, a lot of people are talking about how carbon emissions have gone down. Does this mean that the pandemic was good for the planet?
Well, I think one of the things that the fact that carbon emissions have fallen has shown is that the kind of attitude which you sometimes see from pro-capitalist politicians and from the right-wing press, which almost treats climate change as if it's another force of nature, as if it's something that's completely beyond human control, is obviously complete nonsense. And clearly, this problem is generated by the kind of economy that we have now, which is based primarily on fossil fuels and on burning carbon, putting it into the atmosphere and so on. And clearly, when there's a crisis, that can mean, entirely unintentionally, almost from the point of view of capitalism, that you can, as a side effect, get some reduction in the carbon emissions. But I think it would be a real mistake for us to take this as meaning that somehow COVID is going to provide a solution to the climate crisis. In fact, quite the opposite. One of the things that's been pointed out is that things like the tremendous drop in oil prices, again, that might seem like something which is perhaps positive for the climate because it's a crisis for the oil companies. Actually, what it will mean under a capitalist market system is that other forms of renewable energy become less competitive. So perversely, this could actually lead to renewables and so on being more, less able to compete under capitalism, and oil becoming more dominant in the next few years. So actually, this is not a good thing. And obviously, aside from that, there's the general effects that the pandemic is having on the world's population, on working class people. What it does show is that on the basis of a reorganization of our economy, it should be possible to massively reduce climate change and emissions in a very short space of time. And what socialists call for is public ownership over the big monopolies that dominate in energy, that dominate in other sectors, the big polluters who have had to shut down in many cases because of this pandemic. And when they've shut down, things have started to improve. We say we need public ownership over those, democratic control.
Thanks so much, Claire. So now I want to move on to our next segment, and I want to introduce our special guest. We have Eric Jenkins from Philly, who is a college student and an activist in, previously in the Black Lives Matter movement. How's it going, Eric? Today we're going to talk specifically about, systematic racism and how it's affecting us today, and the potential movements that we can see. Recently in the United States, many of you may have seen, there was two mainly, I'm sure there were many more that we have yet to hear about, but two mainly that many people are talking about, horrific murders of young Black Americans. First, we had Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot and killed by two known white supremacists. And actually, pictures have just come out recently of one of these men at a Klan rally holding a flag. And the murder was recorded by a third person who did not call 911, did not try to intervene. And all Ahmaud was doing was simply out for a jog in the South, in Georgia, 25-year-old man. It's absolutely horrific. But also we saw another case of Breonna Taylor, also, living in the southern part of the United States, was shot to death 8 times in her own home at night during a police raid at the incorrect house. The house they were going to was 10 miles away. Her boyfriend shot back one time with a gun that he legally could own and carry, was afterwards arrested for shooting back. And Breonna Taylor, not only, was she a young woman in her home at night, she was a frontline worker. And not that raises any sort of profile, but it just goes to show, the effects and how terrible police brutality is on the working class. So I want to go first to Eljeer. Could you briefly just talk about what your analysis is of the relationship of systematic racism to capitalism, and what really is the solution to this problem?
Well, the United States is a very unique society. From the very beginning of the development of American capitalism, you had slavery that was rooted in a racial construction on one side. Then with the end of slavery through the Civil War, you had the period of segregation as well for 90 years. Right? This was always about controlling, corralling Black labor in U.S. society. And so when we think of capitalism, we have to think of institutional racism. We have to look at it from a lens that this is about class and race. This is a particular moment where certainly we had just lived through the 8 years of the first Black president, Barack Hussein Obama, and concretely it did not end any of the systemic violence against Black workers and youth in U.S. society. In fact, in the midst of his second term, the rise of BLM, Black Lives Matter, was born. And so that highlighted for many of us the fact that the system of capitalism breeds racism, it breeds sexism and homophobia in the society, and that it socializes ordinary working people. It creates these divided lines among working people. So we don't see our commonality, in fact. And so we're at a moment now where you have on one side police violence, and then you have vigilante violence. And they're all both interlocked together because of the very concept that Black lives don't matter, in fact. And certainly Black labor never mattered unless it was able to be used as a profit motive in American history. So.
Thanks so much, Eljeer. I want to hear from Eric. We haven't heard from you yet. What do you take when you hear stories like this, or you see these types of things happening? What's your take on the situation for Black Americans today in America?
I think the situation is one, we're living in a system that is hostile to Black working people. One point that is not often raised in CNN, MSNBC, that yes, there were Black people and that these were racist attacks, but also working class people as well. That Ahmaud Arbery talked a lot about a working class life, talked about the toil, working a 9-to-5 job. Breonna Taylor and Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker, the person who got arrested, was going to work at the post office, as his father tells us, and Breonna Taylor was an essential worker. So often the class element is like not really addressed, that what is actually happening is that Black working people lives do not matter, and that was decided by Barack Obama. However, they need us for to be essential workers. So there's like this contradiction here. And I think we're going to continue seeing like this deteriorating situation as like, and I think we talked about later on, as Black people are searching for answers to combat this, but ultimately we need to remember that it's not just because we're Black that we're being killed. It's not like our Blackness is causing this. It's because that we're also working people, that they need to keep us divided, they need to keep us suppressed. That it's not just out of hatred alone, but it is actually a feature of the system. So I think the last thing I'll say is that often how it's framed is that this is a exceptional case, that even people like Joe Biden can clearly call out the racism, but we should really remember that this is not an exception. This is the rule of the system, and it is meant there for a purpose, to separate Black people, to keep us fearful of organizing in the workplaces, of being fearful of stepping outside. And that's the situation right now.
Thanks so much, Eric. Now I want to ask Eljeer, thinking about what Black people can do in the short term, I'm seeing a lot on social media, I'm talking to friends and family, that the solution is Black people arming themselves. What do you say to people who say that, well, in order to protect ourselves, we need to arm ourselves?
Certainly throughout US history, this is not a new phenomenon, right? We can go back to the 1918, 1919, the rash of racial violence against Black workers and youth in the South and throughout the United States. They call it the race riots or Red Summer. There was a demand at that time for Black folks to not only organize, but to arm themselves in self-defense. We can go back to Robert F. Williams, 1959. He writes a book called Negroes with Guns. He was the leader of the NAACP North Carolina Monroe branch. We can talk about the Black Panther Party of October 1966 and patrolling Oakland communities, right, against police violence. We can talk about Malcolm X, who said we should have gun clubs. We can highlight an organization that I think is probably the most important of them all, is Deacons for Defense. They were a clandestine organization made up of former Army personnel, veterans from World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, that talked about not just self-defense, but about union organizing. And the first thing I would say, certainly, that the right to self-defense is very important. But the key question is to understand the consciousness of the working class and how do we organize on a concrete basis. That's the missing element, I think, when I hear people say, well, we have to arm ourselves. How are we organizing in the community, in the workplace? It's very essential to use every tactic we can. Protest, nonviolent civil disobedience, the weapon of the strike, which I think is returning back onto the scene of the working class using that weapon to stop production on a daily basis. And so I think it's very important to understand how the state has responded historically with Black people having guns in their possession, right? The Mudford Bill was passed in 1967. Basically, that bill in California disarmed the Black Panther Party. And so the Black Panther Party could not have open weapons out in the open, right? So we know that the state will attack. So we have to build a mass movement. We have to build a movement that can reach every generation of working people, particularly Black workers and youth, and begin to put forward ideas and a program that fights back effectively. Because frankly, let's be clear, the state is has a militarized essence to it. And we have seen them and what they've done in Ferguson and in Baltimore just 5 years ago when the rebellions took place. So it's going to be very important how we organize from this point going forward.
Eljeer, I'm very glad you brought up what happened in Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, and I do want to get into that. But first, I want to hear from Claire. Racism, although in the United States has, played a huge role in the consciousness of the American working class. We can go on and on for days about that, but racism is not just an American problem. So can you talk a little bit about, the problems of racism that we're seeing in Europe today?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I wanted to say I completely agree with the points that both Eric and Eljeer have made about racism being essentially something which is endemic within the capitalist system, foundational to it. And that's true across the world, of course. And one of the things that I think is really being highlighted by this crisis is that working class people are at the heart of the response to COVID. And that's working class people in all their diversity. So if you look at the National Health Service in Britain and the workforce there, it's very, very diverse. And you see people of all races, all ethnicities, migrants, all of those kinds of people who are absolutely on the front line in saving people's lives and in treating people who are ill and in providing all of the services which are keeping society going right now. And that's not lost, I don't think, on the general public. So that can have the effect of building solidarity and hopefully of challenging some of the racist ideas which exist. However, one of the things I think is also going on right now is because capitalism is facing a tremendous crisis and a huge economic catastrophe, they are attempting to use the question of racism in order to protect themselves in a situation in which there's the potential for mass uprisings of ordinary people against the conditions that they're going to be forced to suffer over the next periods. So you have this irony in Britain of Boris Johnson coming out on the street once a week to clap for key workers and clap for all these workers who, like I say, disproportionately are from ethnic minorities and Black and Asian workers and so on. Comes out on his street clapping for them. Then at the same time in Parliament, he and his government are pushing through a really nasty draconian immigration bill, which will target many of these workers directly and will bring in a points-based system, ratchet up what already exists in Britain, which is a so-called hostile environment, which is a racist policy which has been used against many families who've lived here, their whole lives essentially, who came here during the Windrush and so on. So we have to, I think, guard against that in the next period. And it's essential that the workers' movement is an anti-racist movement and takes up this question, because if this poison is kind of allowed into the workers' movement, it's really destructive. So absolutely agree with what's been said.
Thanks, Claire. I totally agree with you that, our fight against racism can't just be on that. We need to bring that into our lives, into our unions, into our workplaces. I totally agree. So I want to go back to what Eljeer was talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. I know for me, being in the US, this was very influential on my life. So can you talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter and the consciousness of young people and what that really did for, the working class movement in general?
I think what it did, it was a life-affirming banner for a whole generation that didn't live through the revolutionary 1950s and 60s, the height of the civil rights movement, the height of the Black Power movement. And so for a generation, that banner, that Black Lives Matter banner, became a rallying cry, not at the exclusion of other people, but to say that we are dying at a tremendous rate proportion to our population in this nation. This is levels of historic and generational violence that we've had to deal with, in fact. At the same time, you've had more Black people in public office, on television, in sports, and entertainment, and still Black workers are dying, Black young people are dying at a tremendous rate. And so the essence of that movement, that moment, really transformed the consciousness of so many. And then, of course, the explosions of Ferguson and Baltimore also, I think, etched in the minds of many young Black workers and youth that maybe this is a time that we can fight for the things that we need on a daily basis. And so, but what has happened of the recent period is that BLM has taken a step backwards, in fact, as an organization, as a political expression at the moment. Right now, it is a slogan. as a powerful slogan. But what is needed is organization of a different character than in the previous period. And so BLM certainly will be etched in history, but ultimately to end racial oppression, to tear down the edifice of American capitalism and institutional racism, we will have to go further.
Thanks, Eljeer. So, Eric, Eljeer just said we need to take this movement further. What does that look like, though? How can we take the Black Lives Matter movement to the next level to have a more successful or influential effect on, Black lives?
So I think there's four main things, and these critiques aren't made out of spite for the Black Lives Matter activists, but the Black radical tradition and also the radical working class tradition and the socialist tradition debate is essential for fighting against the system that we are facing, the capitalist system. We have to make sure that we're doing things correctly. And I think one thing is organization. I think organization is crucial. And before the Black Lives Matter took a loose affiliated network, primarily made of NGOs or non-governmental organizations and nonprofits, which is not an awful thing, but it lacks the actual central force that is needed for this struggle, especially against the state and its armed forces, which is the police departments around the country. And this leadership could be electable from the community. It could have people from the unions as well. And that brings me to another point, linking the struggle for unionization in the United States with the Black Lives Matter movement. Black people have always been supporters of unions, even when during the mistakes of the past, when the AFL had white-only unions, Black workers still wanted to be in unions because they recognize that what happens in the workplace is directly connected with their lives. If they get that $10 extra from their bosses for unpaid wages, they had to join the union because the bosses were not going to fight for them. In fact, they were just going to point to that Black worker as the cause. So we need to reunite that connection and say that the Black struggle is also a worker struggle. And that leads me to another point, is the primacy of having a clear political orientation. Black Lives Matter before didn't really, they critiqued the problems and there were some positive programs, but nevertheless, they didn't actually point to another way to organize society. That we have to recognize that we cannot just get rid of race and keep capitalism. You have to get rid of the whole system because the whole system is rotten. And racism was one of the reasons why capitalism was allowed to develop massively, with not just talking about slavery in the Americas, but slavery all over the world, and colonialism and imperialism. So you can't get rid of race, and that means pointing to another alternative society, and that means socialism. And the last thing I think, and I think it's crucial, and I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, that while the movement is called Black Lives Matter, we have to recognize there's divisions in the Black community. And a lot of mainstream media don't want to talk about that because they never actually talked to a Black worker, probably in their lives, except for a 5-minute interview. That there's a reason why the majority of people that are in prisons are Black workers. The reason why that a lot of people who are killed by the police, Black people, are Black workers. And that we will fight to defend any Black people from police brutality, rich or poor. We have to recognize that some of the same people that are benefiting from this police brutality is Black people. And what can better show that is how Obama responded to Ferguson, calling the protesters thugs and criminals who need to be arrested, but then praising the so-called bravery of the Ferguson Police Department. It's like the saying now, all skinfolk ain't kinfolk, that there are divisions here, that we are workers and we're willing to fight for you, even if you're rich, to make sure you don't get killed by a cop, but the solutions have to be based and benefited by the working class. I think just to wrap that up, that if we're able to do these things, we can continue what was left off in the 60s. And I just want to make a short comment on what Eljeer talked about with the arming in the 60s of the Black Panther Party. There was not only just the guns, but it was also the politics, which was socialism, that truly scared them. Because they weren't just saying we're to get guns, we're going to shoot at cops, but we were going to organize the community for self-defense and also educate them pointing to an alternative system. And when that happened, that's when the gun control laws started getting passed. That's it.
Thank you for that, Eric. You talked a lot about Obama, and oftentimes he's pointed as, well, yeah, like I want a time, get rid of Trump. Let's go back to the time of Obama. But you kind of laid out how that, that wasn't necessarily the answer. We don't want to see, Black oppressors. We want Black people to be liberated and not be exploited. But now, it's, what month is it? I've lost track of time during this pandemic. I had to look. It's the end of May. And so November is coming very quickly. Eric, what do you tell Black voters to do at the polls? Do we continue with this abusive relationship that we have with the Democratic Party?
I would say what Martin Luther King said to Harry Belafonte, that he was afraid that we integrated into a burning house that is the Democratic Party. And I would say that we should voice our disagreements with a protest vote. And I want to be clear that there's some people that are saying like, well, the vote doesn't matter. You can just vote for Biden. Everything is okay. And I'm here to say the vote does matter, that Black working people have fought and died for the right to vote. And we shouldn't throw it away to someone, Joe Biden, who thinks, apparently, even with his lukewarm apology, that Black people owe him the vote for the virtue of being a Democrat, the same person that ensured a system that enslaved, which is modern slavery, the prison industrial complex, millions of Black people, that this system that he helped build. Now, The Intercept was reporting that Biden actually encouraged Reagan to increase arrests of Black people. So it's ridiculous to ask Black working people to throw away their vote to someone that has time and again opposed the liberation of Black people. So I will say that when you go to those polls, remember what Biden did and let them know that you will no longer be taken around this ride of disappointment and treated with absolute disregard, that Black working people had enough time waiting. It's just like what James Baldwin said. He has been waiting, his ancestors have been waiting, and it's time. I'm not waiting anymore. So I will say go to the polls and don't vote Joe Biden and register it with a protest vote.
Thank you so much, Eric. I was absolutely disgusted with that interview with Joe Biden and Charlemagne the God, who was a radio host in New York City. How dare Joe Biden look that man in the face and say, if you don't vote for me, then you're not Black. Just this hold that he thinks that he has over people is absolutely ridiculous. So we have a couple comments here that I just wanted to highlight. I think they're super interesting. Paul from Britain says that in Britain, Black and minority people are disproportionately being killed by COVID-19. And then Alice from Brazil says, here in Brazil, 2 boys were murdered by the police, one of them inside the house, the other on his way back from delivering food in solidarity. Both were Black and lived in the favela, and that killed them. In capitalism, this will continue to be the case. This is the way that it works. Eljeer, I'm wondering your thoughts, especially, what Alice said from Brazil. And, we know in Brazil, we have some of the largest proportions of Black people outside of Africa. They go through many of the same struggles that we do in the US. So what do you say to Alice? And then also for our viewers, if you could highlight your favorite Black Marxists, because you're a Marxist and we want to spread that word. So if you could do that too, that'd be great.
Right. Well, here in New York, COVID-19 has devastated communities of color. In those communities, many of them are frontline workers, essential workers. Many of them are living through really a truly precarious life, right? That the pandemic and now the Great Depression has literally pushed them over the edge. And so what is going on in Brazil or what's going on in Britain is absolutely no different than what is going on in New York or any other part of the United States. It's part of, in fact, the generational and historic lack of resources in communities of color, and particularly working class communities of color, right? If you have pre-existing conditions, heart disease, diabetes, COVID-19 can exacerbate those conditions. And in fact, if you're lucky to survive it, you may have even worse conditions post-COVID-19. So the question of healthcare, the question of jobs at a living wage and union benefits, these things are vital resources that many people, particularly in places like the Bronx, actually, we hear of the Bronx because of the New York Yankees have their multi-billion-dollar stadium there, but we don't talk about the immigrants that live in the Bronx, Black and brown workers and youth that live in the Bronx, that in fact, many people call it Asthma Alley because of the amount of traffic that goes through these communities that are devastating to the idea of a lack of oxygen for working people. So just imagine the effects of COVID-19, which attacks your lungs primarily. My favorite Marxist, well, you know, Marxism has been in the United States going since the 1860s. It has a very uneven history in the United States, but it has a really powerful history in the United States. And certainly there are so many I could talk about. I could talk about the organization African Blood Brotherhood, which was an organization after the Russian Revolution had joined the Third International in 1919. They were Black nationalists in the beginning, but they converted to revolutionary socialism and joined the Third International, led by Lenin and Trotsky. I could talk about Reverend George Washington Woodbine. He was the second known Black socialist in the United States. He was a member of the Socialist Party. He used to speak for the Democratic Party at different lectures and rallies. And they told him to stop speaking. Why? Because he was going to speeches of Eugene Victor Debs. And they said that he started to sound too much like Eugene Victor Debs. And hopefully everybody knows who Debs is, a legendary figure in the labor movement and the socialist movement. But my favorite, I'm gonna stop here, is Hubert H. Harrison, a man born in the Caribbean who migrated to the United States. He was a postal worker, actually. And to touch on Eric's point, the post office and Black workers and socialism, there's a great history tied there. And so Hubert H. Harrison he was known as the Malcolm X before Malcolm X. He was known as the Dr. King before Dr. King. He was a brilliant mind, raising not just socialism, but linking the question of theory, of political action and organizing. He was an editor. He spoke of the working class, and he gave lectures on the street. He was one of the most famous street orators from the place that I'm born and raised, and I'm proud of, Harlem, New York. So Hubert H. Harrison is my favorite, a Black Marxist, and one of the most greatest Marxists of all time in my mind.
I should have asked you this question pre-quarantine so I could get some good reading in. But thank you so much for sharing. I have one last question, and this is for Claire. This question comes from Martha in Philadelphia, Eric's hometown. So the question is, the economic crisis is already causing local and state governments to put forward harsh austerity budgets with cuts and layoffs. How can we best fight back against these layoffs in this era of social distancing?
Thanks. Well, I think, first of all, it's got to be said that whenever capitalism faces a crisis, then the ruling class will attempt, capitalist governments will attempt to make working class people foot the bill for it. And that's going to be the case with this COVID crisis. We've already got all over the world, I know especially in the United States, mass unemployment now developing and huge hardship, which working class people are already beginning to suffer. But I think that we have to say that it's not inevitable that this is how things go, that the next 10 years are going to be like the last 10 years, except even worse in terms of harsh cuts, in terms of people suffering massive austerity. There's that slogan which has kind of become popular of no going back to normal, because normal was the problem. And I think we need to take that up. So the crucial thing that we need to do is to get organised. And that means working class people getting together in their workplaces, in their communities and fighting back. And of course, in that era of social distancing, like the questioner said, we need to get a bit creative with that. We need to organise, like we've seen in some countries, socially distanced protests. We need to use our power as workers. We know that workers have already been taking action against unsafe conditions, refusing to work if they're not going to be given the PPE that they need, for example, and so on. We need to take and draw on those examples, and we need to try and link up those struggles together around a political programme, because I think that's the other crucial thing. We know that this system is sick in every way. The fact that this pandemic has been allowed to spread throughout the world is a symptom of a system which is unable to meet human needs and which is unable to adequately respond to crises and to things which pose a threat to human life. And if we are going to see a situation over the next decades in which our children and their children can look towards a better future for themselves rather than one which is going to be much harder, that needs to be on the basis of a very different kind of society, one in which the needs of working class people come first, not the demands of profit. So we need to fight against every attack. We need to fight to defend every single job. We need to fight to defend all of our services. And we also need to point towards a different society, a socialist society run by and for working people.
Thank you so much, Claire. I couldn't agree with you more. And I want to thank our three speakers, Eric, Eljeer, and Claire, for this exciting discussion. Before we go, I want to do our shout out of the week from one section of the International Socialist Alternative. Did anyone guess it? Students fighting back and winning? The Socialist Party in Ireland. Irish students get their exams canceled by fighting back. The Irish government tried to force students to sit leaving final exams despite schools being shut down for months. Standardized testing, as we know around the world, shows the inequalities that we have in our school systems. Working class students can oftentimes cannot afford to take the extra test prep classes. Many working class students have jobs, so they don't have as much time to study. And standardized testing really shows those inequalities. But in Ireland, students, parents, and teachers organized online petitions of tens of thousands of people to demand that these exams not be given. Now, they were demanding this not just because of PPE and logistics of health and safety, which of course are very real concerns, but also the stress young people are under in these uncertain times. And then having another responsibility of studying for an exam without necessarily a quiet place like a classroom or a library to do their reading. Hundreds of thousands fought back, and the International Socialist Alternative members in Ireland, which is called the Socialist Party, played a key role. Shout out to Mick Berry, who's a member of parliament and also the Socialist Party, who spearheaded the campaign, and newly founded Socialist Students organized a virtual rally with thousands attending. We have articles linking people to be able to read about this huge victory. And I just want to say solidarity to all of those young people in Ireland. You're inspiring people across the globe with the work that you've done. If you, haven't had a chance to check out our website of International Socialist Alternative, the example I just gave of the students in Ireland is the type of work that we are conducting all around the world every day. So please check out our website and get involved in your country. That's all for today. Tune in next Sunday for A World to Win. Same time, same place.
We have to make a decision as ordinary working people that we must organize for a political, economic, and social alternative.
It's actually Stalinism itself that has prevented so many people from drawing the same conclusions that Lenin drew.
The limits of this planet are the limits also of capitalism.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. We discuss pressing issues, highlight current events and active struggles, answer questions, and we bring the lessons of history to the present day. World to Win is hosted by the International Socialist Alternative, an organization made up of sections in more than 30 countries and existing on every continent. We don't just make this show. We're actively organizing in workplaces and communities every day. We're living in an era of one crisis tumbling right into the next, a deadly pandemic into a global depression.
This is a far, far more serious crisis for their system than that.
A global depression into potential climate chaos. Yet, at the same time, we're witnessing a momentous return of the labor movement, of workplace organizing, with more people getting up and getting involved every day.
Tens of thousands of people are going out to protest every week.
We need to rise to meet these new challenges. Tune in every Sunday to hear socialists from across the world talk about what's happening now and where to go next. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternative's YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!